A poor farmer helped a girl on the road, and a year later she made him a multi-millionaire. Deep night caught Mark on his small farm plot. 2 barns, a couple of old tractors, and a nearly crumbling house were all he could salvage after 10 years of endless hardship. The farm had once belonged to his father, and before that his grandfather. Mark was the only one who refused to leave for the city, despite the entreaties of friends and relatives. He was only 35, but the constant work on the farm and lack of proper rest made him look older than his years. Mark's financial situation was dire. Dry seasons, rising fuel and food prices had brought him to a state where every penny counted. However, despite all the hardships, Mark remained a kind and open person. He helped his neighbors when they had problems and often helped people in difficult situations. That night he planned to just go to bed. It had been a tough day, a broken tractor, a water system on strike, and unbearable heat. All that changed, however, when he heard the sound of an engine nearby. As he stepped out onto the porch, he saw a car standing on the side of the road. Mark, sighing, put on his work boots and walked to the car. "Do you need help?" he asked as he got closer. The driver was a young woman, looking about 25. Her clothes were wrinkled and her face showed fatigue. The car stalled. "I don't know what to do," she said, almost on the verge of panic. Mark asked her to open the hood. After examining the engine, he realized the problem was more serious than expected. "It needs repair, not just an oil change," he said. The girl seemed ready to cry. "I don't have the money for repairs, and I have to go." Mark had seen people like this many times. Apparently, she was the kind of person who was used to fighting for every opportunity. "Don't worry. I'll help you. I've got some old tools. Maybe I can fix it up a little so you can get to the nearest service." He worked for nearly 2 hours, in the dark and by the light of an old flashlight. All that time the girl sat on the curb watching his efforts. "Why are you doing this?" she finally asked. "Because someone once helped me, too," he answered simply. When the engine finally started, she looked like she couldn't believe her eyes. "Thank you," she said, holding out her hand. "My name is Leah." "Mark," he replied, smiling. The girl promised to return the favor, but Mark only waved it away. "The important thing is that you get home safely." Leah drove off, leaving Mark with a slight smile on his face. He returned to the house, not even realizing how this incident would change his life forever. It had been exactly a year since the night Mark had helped Leah on the road. Life on the farm had gone on without much change. Finances remained tight, but Mark had learned to survive by saving on everything except feed for his animals. One morning, while he was drinking coffee on his front porch, the mailman came to his mailbox. "You have an unusual letter today, Mark," the mailman said, holding out an envelope. The letter looked strange. It was a heavy, good-quality envelope with gold-colored letters. There was only one word on it, Mark. Opening the envelope, Mark felt a strange excitement. Inside was a small note and a key. "Mark, thank you for the other night. You have no idea how much you helped me. Come by tomorrow at 11 in the morning at the address on the back. Leah." Mark reread the note several times, trying to figure out what it meant. Remembering the girl, he only shrugged. Maybe she wants to return the favor? He thought. I don't need anything from her, though. The next day he dressed in his best clothes, a neat but simple shirt and old but clean jeans. He got into his old car and drove to the address he had been given. When he reached the place, a real shock awaited him. The address led to a huge modern building surrounded by a beautiful park. Mark couldn't even imagine that behind those doors lurked something related to Leah. He climbed the steps and opened the door with the key that was in the envelope. Inside, he was greeted by a reception desk decorated in a modern minimalist style. A smiling uniformed girl greeted him as if she knew who he was. "Mark? Leah's expecting you. Step into the conference room." Mark entered a spacious room. Large windows, expensive furniture, and in the middle of it all, Leah. She was standing at the window, dressed in an elegant business suit, looking very different from a year ago. "Leah?" he asked, perplexed. She turned, smiling. "Yes, Mark. I promised I'd pay you back, but it was you who really changed my life." Her words were intriguing. Mark didn't understand what was going on, but he sensed that this was just the beginning of something big. Leah gestured for Mark to sit down at the large table in the center of the room. He obediently sat down, trying to cope with the growing excitement. She placed a cup of coffee in front of him and took a seat across from him. "Mark, you're probably wondering what this is all about," she began, her voice soft but confident. "I want to tell you a story that no one still knows." Mark nodded, though his head was already full of questions. Leah paused, gathering her thoughts. "A year ago, when you found me on that road, I was at rock bottom," she admitted, lowering her gaze. "I had no money, no home, no job. All I had left was a broken-down car and a broken relationship with the world." Mark looked at her incredulously. "But you looked like—" "Well, you certainly didn't seem poor," he said cautiously. Leah smiled sadly. "It was just a mask, Mark. The truth is, I lost everything because of a mistake I made in the past. I left my family, trying to prove to everyone that I could make a life for myself. But things didn't work out the way I planned. You were the first person in months to show me real kindness. Uncompensated." Her words touched Mark. He remembered that night, her tired face and eyes full of pain. "But that doesn't explain how you ended up here in this magnificent building," he said, looking around. Leah laughed, lightly and sincerely. "After that night, I thought about my mistakes. Your kindness inspired me. I started looking for a job, even the simplest one. Soon I was lucky enough to get a job at a company where my skills were quickly noticed. I was promoted, and step by step I got my life back. But all the while, I thought about you, about what you'd done for me. And I knew I had to find a way to repay that debt to you." Mark was silent, mulling over her words. He felt proud of Leah, but he didn't understand why she was talking to him about it. "But why me?" he finally asked. Leah leaned forward, her eyes glistening with emotion. "Because without you, none of this would have happened. You were the starting point, and I want to do something meaningful for you in return." Mark wanted to object, but she held up a hand to stop him. "Please, let me take it from here. You have no idea what I have in store for you." Mark felt the excitement building again. He didn't know what else to say, so he just nodded, letting Leah continue. Leah got up from the table and without saying a word, walked over to a large dresser against the wall. She pulled out one of the drawers and pulled out an envelope from there. Returning to the table, she placed it in front of Mark. "Open it," she suggested, watching his reaction. Mark took the envelope in his hands, his fingers trembling slightly. The paper was thick, expensive, and there was a gold seal with some initials on it. He opened it slowly, feeling the tension building. Inside was a document printed on an equally luxurious piece of paper. Mark began to read aloud. "Asset transfer agreement," his voice trailed off and he looked at Leah. "What does that mean?" She smiled and leaned back in her chair. "It means, Mark, that you are now the owner of a small but thriving business. This project has been my dream. And now I want to pass it on to you. Mark froze. He reread the document again, trying to find a catch or a joke. But the words on the paper were real. Leah, are you serious? I can't accept this. It's too. He searched for the right words, but there was no way they came. She put her hand on his palm, her gaze was firm but kind. You can, Mark. And you should. You're the person who changed my life when no one else would have. I couldn't have gotten back on my feet without you. Now it's my turn to help you. Mark looked at the document again. He felt lost, overwhelmed, as if his life had suddenly become different. But why me? You could have kept it, or invested it, or, he hesitated, not knowing how to finish. Because you deserve more than that, Mark. I've seen you live. Your hard work, your honesty, it's inspiring. People like you deserve a chance. And I want to be the person who gives you that chance. Mark closed his eyes, trying to comprehend what was happening. Leah was right, he had worked all his life, but he had never been able to achieve what he dreamed of. And now fate, in the person of this woman, was giving him a chance he hadn't expected. Leah. I don't know what to say, he finally said, his voice trembling. Say yes, she smiled. And give this case a chance. Mark looked at the document again, and then at Leah. His heart was full of gratitude and embarrassment. All right, he finally said. I'll take it. Leah clapped her hands together, her eyes shining with joy. You won't regret it, Mark. I promise. The next morning Mark woke up earlier than usual. His mind was still in chaos from yesterday's events. He sat at the kitchen table, looking at the signed contract. Leah had insisted he take it home. The paper felt like it was burning his hands. Is this really happening to me? He thought. The phone lying on the table suddenly vibrated. Mark flinched in surprise. It was Leah. Good morning, Mark, her voice sounded cheerful. I hope you're ready for your first day as a businessman. Mark grinned. To be honest, Leah, I still think this is some kind of dream. Well, then it's time to make sure it's reality. I expect you in an hour at our office. Mark quickly got dressed and headed into town. The office building turned out to be cozy but classy. Leah met him in the lobby with a wide smile. Welcome to your new life, Mark. She walked him through all the offices, introducing the staff and showing him how everything worked. The staff appeared friendly, although some looked at Mark with surprise and even distrust. He felt their stares, but tried not to show it. You have a great team now. Your ideas and energy can help grow the business even more, Leah said as they entered his new office. Mark looked around the spacious room with large windows and a desk that looked like it could fit half of his farmhouse. He sat down in a chair and felt a strange combination of excitement and anxiety. Leah, I've never run anything like this before, he admitted. She laughed and sat down across from him. And you don't have to. You have a team for that. You're their inspiration. Your principles of life, honesty, hard work, that's what they will respect. I'll help you get used to it. Throughout the day, Leah explained in detail how the business worked. It was a small startup producing organic products, which had already begun to attract customers. Mark didn't immediately understand the complexity of the business, but every time he felt lost, Leah patiently explained everything again. When the workday came to an end, Mark went outside and took a deep breath. He felt exhausted but inspired. This is the start of something new, he thought as he looked at the sunset. Despite the busy day, it took Mark a long time to fall asleep. He lay in bed looking up at the wooden ceiling he had gotten used to over the many years of living on the farm. The thought that he was no longer just a farmer but the manager of an entire business stirred him. But in the back of his mind lurked a sense of unease. Everything that was happening seemed too good to be true. He remembered his grandfather's words to him as a child, "If something seems too simple, there's a trap buried somewhere." The next day, Mark arrived at the office again. Leah, as always, greeted him with a smile and a cup of coffee. "Are you ready for the next stage? Today will be the presentation of our new product," she said, handing him a folder of documents. "A presentation?" Mark frowned. "I didn't think I was ready for that kind of task yet." "You'll be fine," Leah assured him. "You just tell people about your passion for natural products. We'll do the rest." The presentation room was filled to capacity. Journalists, investors, bloggers, they were all expecting to see something new. Mark felt his palms start to sweat. He wanted to run away, back to the farm where everything was predictable. But when he got on stage and started talking, everything changed. He talked about how important it was to take care of nature, how he grew his own fruits and vegetables, and how he wanted people to eat quality food. His words were sincere, and it could be felt. The crowd gave him a standing ovation. After the event, one of the journalists, a tall man with a cold stare, approached Mark. "Your story is impressive, mister," the journalist looked at him carefully. "But tell me, have you always been so successful?" Mark was taken aback by the question. The journalist continued. "I heard that your farm was barely keeping afloat. Don't you find it strange that such an upsurge came from a chance encounter?" Mark felt the ground slipping from under his feet. The journalist clearly knew more than he should have. But why? When Mark got home, he started going over the man's words in his head again. Leah had seemed so sincere, but for some reason her motivation suddenly seemed suspicious to him. That night, too, passed in thought. Mark didn't know who he could trust and who he couldn't. The next morning Mark woke up with a firm decision: he had to figure out what was behind it all. The journalist, Leah, his sudden success, it all seemed like a puzzle that needed to be put together. But first, he decided to talk to Leah directly. When he entered the office, she was sitting at her desk, absorbed in papers as usual. Leah smiled when she saw him, but Mark noticed a slight tension in her eyes. "Leah, we need to talk," he began, closing her office door behind him. She looked puzzled, but nodded and gestured for him to sit down. "Of course, Mark. Is something wrong? You know, I've always found it odd that someone like you would suddenly decide to help me." His voice was calm but firm. "Why me? Why didn't you go to someone more experienced?" Leah was silent for a while, scrutinizing his face. Then she sighed heavily and folded her hands on the table. "I knew you'd ask that question sooner or later," she said. "Good. You deserve the truth." Mark felt his heart beat faster. Leah stood up, went to the window and looked outside. "When I saw you on the road, you reminded me of someone. My father." Her voice trembled. "He was a farmer, like you. Worked from dawn to dusk to provide for our family. But one day he took out a loan to expand his business and lost everything." "That's terrible," Mark said, feeling his suspicions begin to dissipate. "But why me?" Leah turned back to her desk and met his gaze. "Because when I saw your farm, your passion for what you do, I realized, you have something my father didn't. You don't give up. You deserve a chance." Mark was silent, digesting what he'd heard. Her words sounded sincere, but somewhere in the back of his mind there was doubt. Something in her story didn't add up. But what it was, he didn't understand yet. "Leah, I'm grateful for everything you've done," he said at last. "But I need to know, is there something else you haven't told me? She smiled slightly and shook her head. Mark, I'll always be on your side. If you have any questions, just ask. His anxiety subsided a little, but it didn't disappear completely. At that moment he realized that he wasn't ready to trust her completely yet. The next day Mark returned home later than usual. It had been a busy day on the farm, and thoughts of talking to Leah kept him busy. It seemed to him that things had gotten too smooth to be true. Tired, he was about to go to bed when he heard a knock on the door. At first he thought he heard it. No one usually came at that time. But the knock was repeated, and Mark reluctantly rose from his chair, heading for the door. On the threshold stood a stranger in an austere suit. His face was serious, and he held a folder in his hands. Mark frowned as he looked at the man. "Good evening, Mr. Mark," the stranger said. "May I come in? We need to talk." "Who are you?" Mark asked, not hiding his incredulity. "My name is Edward," the man introduced himself. "I represent the interests of a large company. I assure you, this won't take long, but for your own good, it's best to listen." Mark hesitated, but finally opened the door wider, letting the stranger in. They walked into the living room and Mark gestured to a chair. "Okay, I'm listening," he said, taking a seat across from Edward. The man carefully placed the folder on the table and opened it. The first few pages were photos of Leah, apparently taken recently. Mark froze, surprised by what he saw. "What does this mean?" he asked. Edward looked at him with a slight smile. "Leah is not who she says she is," he began. "Her interest in you is far from casual." Mark's heart beat faster. He leaned forward, trying to get a better look at the documents. The pictures showed Leah meeting with some people he didn't know. There were also reports in the folder that mentioned big deals she'd been involved in. Was this some kind of prank? Mark could feel the anger and anxiety starting to build. "No, Mr. Mark," Edward replied calmly. "Leah is part of a game that aims to gain control of your farm. She works for investors who've had their eye on the land for a long time." Edward's words came out of the blue. Mark stared at him, trying to figure out what was true and what was false. "Why should I believe you?" he finally asked. Edward shrugged. "You don't have to. But if you want to know the truth, I suggest you be careful. Leah isn't what she wants to be." With those words, he stood up, leaving the folder on the table. "I'm sure you'll come to the right conclusions, Mr. Mark. Good day to you." Mark gave him a look and then slowly opened the folder, trying to make sense of what was happening. Everything he saw was confusing him even more. There was only one thing he was sure of now: he had to find out who Leah really was. The next day, Mark couldn't concentrate on any of his duties. The folder Edward had left behind was hidden in his bedroom, but its contents were literally burning in his mind. He decided it was time to talk to Leah. He needed the truth. When Leah returned to the house after her trip to town, Mark was waiting for her in the living room. His face was grim and his gaze was intense. Leah froze on the threshold, sensing that the conversation was going to be serious. "We need to talk," Mark began, pointing to her chair. She lowered herself gingerly, folding her hands in her lap. "Did something happen?" she asked, trying to sound innocent. Mark didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled out a folder and tossed it on the table. Leah flinched when she saw it. "Will you explain to me what this means?" he said demandingly. Leah leaned forward, her eyes running quickly over the photos and documents. Her face paled, and she remained silent, as if gathering her thoughts. "Who gave you this?" she finally asked. It doesn't matter now, Mark replied stiffly. I want to know who you really are and what you want from me. Leah closed her eyes, took a deep breath and exhaled. When she looked at him again, her eyes were full of tears. I should have told you sooner, she began. But I was afraid. Afraid you wouldn't understand. Mark crossed his arms over his chest, silent, waiting for her explanation. I'm really not who I think I am, Leah admitted. But that doesn't mean that everything that happened between us is a lie. She told him that she worked for an investment company that had long wanted to acquire Mark's farm for a major project. Her job was to get close to him and convince him to sell the land. But things didn't go according to plan when she started spending more time with him. I had no idea you would become so important to me, she said, lowering her gaze. I had given up on their plan, but apparently they decided to proceed without my involvement. Mark was stunned. His trust had been shattered, but deep down he felt there was truth in her words. Why did you decide to stay? He asked, his voice quiet but firm. Because I realized that for the first time in my life I had found what was really important, Leah answered. You and this farm have become the home I never had before. Mark looked away, trying to digest her words. He wanted to believe her, but everything he'd learned in the last 24 hours made him doubt it. Give me time, he finally said. I can't decide everything right now. Leah nodded, her eyes filling with tears again. I understand. Just know that I never meant to hurt you. She got up and left for her room, leaving Mark alone with his thoughts. He sat in silence, looking at the folder and trying to figure out what he should do next. The evening came quickly, but Mark still couldn't find any answers to his questions. Leah locked herself in her room, avoiding his gaze. Her confession was unexpected and painful, but at the same time her tears and trembling voice sounded sincere. Mark sat on the porch with a cup of strong coffee, looking up at the starry sky. This night was quiet, but his thoughts were a storm. He went over in his head everything that had happened in the last few months, her sudden appearance, her care for the farm, her help on the toughest days. How could he doubt her feelings when she had brought so much light into his life? But there was another voice, a voice of betrayal, a reminder that Leah had come here for a purpose. The lantern in front of the house swayed slightly in the wind, making a slight creaking sound. It was a sound that always soothed him, but right now nothing was helping. He pulled out the folder, going over the documents once more. There was no direct evidence of her evil intentions, but the hints were strong enough to sow doubt. The next morning, Mark made a decision. He decided to go to town temporarily to sort out his thoughts away from the farm and Leah. He realized that she needed time to think things over too. I'll be gone for a couple days, he said over breakfast, avoiding her gaze. Don't you want to talk? Leah asked, her voice sounding strained. I need time, Mark replied simply. We both need to figure out what's going on. She nodded, not trying to stop him. Her face was sad, but she knew it was the best decision for both of them. In town, Mark visited his longtime friend and lawyer Joe, who he could trust. He told him everything, showed him the documents in the file. It's a complicated situation, Mark, Joe said, studying the papers. But if she really did abandon their plan and stay, that means something. You have to realize how genuine her feelings are. Mark pondered his friend's words. Deep down he wanted to believe Leah, but trust was something that had to be earned. At the farm, meanwhile, Leah spent the day cleaning the house and doing chores. Her heart was heavy, but she was determined to prove to Mark that her feelings were real. She wrote him a letter, putting everything she was afraid to say into it. In the letter she revealed her fears, her past and how she had changed because of him. She left the letter on his desk, hoping he would read it when he returned. When Mark returned 3 days later, he saw the letter. It was lying neatly on his desk, wrapped in plain white paper. He stared at it for a long time before he decided to open it. His heart beat faster with each word. The letter was simple, but full of emotion. Leah talked about her life, how she was always searching for a place she could call home. And now she had found it. Mark sighed, put the letter down, and closed his eyes. He knew the decision had to be made now. Mark placed the letter back on the table, his hand still trembling slightly. What he had read had touched him to the core. Every word Leah spoke of pain, searching, and hope. She didn't apologize, she didn't make excuses, she simply revealed her heart. The next morning he found her in the garden. Leah was picking weeds with her usual focus. She noticed him but didn't stop, letting him know she didn't want to push him. "Leah," he began, stepping cautiously closer. She straightened, brushed a strand of hair out of her face, and looked up at him. "Yes?" "I read your letter," he said, lowering his gaze to the ground. "And I think we need to talk." They sat down on the porch, as they had done so many times before. Mark laid out his thoughts, his doubts and fears in front of her. He talked about how betrayed he had been before and how hard it was to trust him again. "I'm not perfect, Mark," Leah replied, her voice was calm, but there was sadness in it. "I've made mistakes, and this was one of them. But I want you to know that everything I've done since, I've done because of you. You've become more to me than I could have ever imagined." Mark sighed. He knew this story would never be simple. But deep down, he knew Leah was sincere. She stayed when she could have left, she took care of him and his farm when no one else would have wanted to. "Leah, I want to give us a chance," he said finally, looking her straight in the eye. "But it won't be easy right away. We're both going to have to work hard to regain our trust." She nodded, her eyes filling with tears, but they were tears of relief. "I'm ready, Mark. I'm ready to do whatever it takes to prove to you that my feelings are real." A few months passed. Mark and Leah worked together on the farm, building a new phase of their relationship step by step. The letter she wrote became a kind of symbol of the beginning for them. It remained on the table as a reminder of what they were going through. As time went on, their lives began to be filled with joy and peace. Mark began to trust Leah, and she showed him that she could be his reliable partner. Their farm prospered and their love grew stronger every day. Leah proved that the past can only be a shadow if you give the light of the present a chance to light the way. And Mark realized that sometimes the people who come into our lives can change it forever, even if it starts with pain and doubt. Leah and Mark's story became a new chapter for both of them, a chapter where love and trust conquered everything.